This next article, published on January 28, 1951, delves into the implications of Kefauver threats. A sheriff and 5 gambling figures will be named for citations for refusing to testify before a Senate Crime Committee hearing that ended early today. Chairman Estes Kefauver, Democrat, Tennessee, shortly before leaving for Washington, said he would seek Senate contempt citations against Sheriff Frank Clancy of neighboring Jefferson Parish County, where lush gambling casinos operate openly. Phil Kastel, part owner of the Beverly Country Club in Jefferson Parish and a gambling associate of Frank Costello. Carlos Marcello, part owner of the Swank Beverly Club, whom Kefauver named as one of the United States' worst criminals. And J.J. Fogarty, veteran owner of a race news service. One of worst, Joseph Pareto, a race news service figure whom Kefauver called one of the worst characters ever to appear before the committee, and Anthony Marcello, Carlos's younger brother. In addition, Kefauver said, Orleans Parish criminal Sheriff Johnny Grosh may face perjury charges as a result of the testimony of his ex-wife, Mrs. Viola Grosh, who told of payoffs to her husband by lottery and prostitution agents. Mrs. Grosh testified that her husband, then the chief of city detectives, had $150,000 in a strongbox in their home when she left him in 1940. Her testimony conflicted with Grosh's, who repeatedly denied he ever had a strongbox or safe in his home. She said Grosh accumulated the money during a 6-year period when his salary was less than $400 a month. Believes Mrs. Grosh. I believe Mrs. Grosh was telling the truth, Kefauver said. She filed corroborating documents with the committee to support her testimony, he said. Kefauver pointed out that the United States District Attorney could institute a suit against the sheriff for any perjury pending committee action. The state district attorney said he will study the records. Grosh admitted that gambling and prostitution were wide open in New Orleans when he was chief of detectives, because I was too busy catching thieves and burglars. Kefauver, commenting on Sheriff Clancy's refusal to talk, said, You would think that a sheriff would be the last man in a parish who would worry about incriminating himself by testifying. Sheriff C.J. Dutch Rowley, of neighboring St. Bernard Parish, told the committee that gambling operates in his district, but don't bother to snoop around those places. Courtroom packed. Gretna Town. Marshal Bohr Miller said, There's been gambling in Gretna since Daddy was a law officer. Miller said he doubted if he could be re-elected if he closed down gambling. He has been in office for years. Summing up the 2-day hearing early today in a courtroom filled to overflow, Kefauver said, It should be noted here that we've had more refusals to answer questions in New Orleans than in all of the other hearings together. We've had very arrogant refusals to give testimony from nationally important criminals like Carlos Marcello. The first witness cited by the Senate Committee for Contempt, Harry Russell of Chicago and Miami, goes on trial on contempt charges in Washington Wednesday. Multiple newspapers echoed that warning, highlighting the threat posed by these men. Some newspapers delved into their histories, detailing who these individuals were and the paths they had taken to power. Others simply published lists of their names and their past occupations, making it clear who these dangerous figures were. A sheriff and 5 gambling figures will be named for contempt citations for refusing to testify before a Senate Crime Committee hearing that ended early today. Chairman Estes Kefauver, Democrat, Tennessee, shortly before leaving for Washington, said he would seek Senate contempt citations against Sheriff Frank Clancy of neighboring Jefferson Parish County, where lush gambling casinos operate openly. Phil Kastel, part owner of the Beverly Country Club in Jefferson Parish and a gambling associate of Frank Costello. Carlos Marcello, part owner of the Swank Beverly Club, whom Kefauver named as one of the United States' worst criminals. J.J. Fogarty, veteran owner of a race news service. Joseph Pareto, a race news service figure whom Kefauver called one of the worst characters ever to appear before the committee, and Anthony Marcello, Carlos's younger brother. In addition, Kefauver said, Orleans Parish criminal sheriff Johnny Grosh may face perjury charges as a result of the testimony of his ex-wife, Mrs. Viola Grosh, who told of payoffs to her husband by lottery and prostitution agents. Mrs. Grosh said that her husband, then the chief of city detectives, had $150,000 in a strongbox in their home when she left him in 1940. Her testimony conflicted with Grosh's on Thursday, when he repeatedly denied he ever had a strongbox or safe in his home. She said Grosh accumulated the money during a 6-year period when his salary was less than $400 a month. I believe Mrs. Grosh was telling the truth, Kefauver said. She filed corroborating documents with the committee to support her testimony, he said. Kefauver pointed out that the United States District Attorney could institute a perjury suit against the sheriff without any committee action. The State District Attorney said he would study the records. Grosh admitted that gambling and prostitution were wide open in New Orleans when he was chief of detectives, because I was too busy catching thieves and burglars. Kefauver, commenting on Sheriff Clancy's refusal to talk, said, You would think that a sheriff would be the last man in a parish who would worry about incriminating himself by testifying. Sheriff C.J. Dutch. Rowley of neighbouring St. Bernard Parish told the committee that gambling operates in his district, but I don't bother to snoop around those places. Gretna Town Marshal Beauregard Miller said, There's been gambling in Gretna since my daddy was a law officer. Miller said he doubted if he could be re-elected if he closed down gambling. He has been in office 26 years. Summing up the 2-day hearing early today in a courtroom filled to overflowing, Kefauver said, It should be noted here that we've had more refusals to answer questions in New Orleans than in all of the other hearings together. We've had some very arrogant refusals to give testimony from nationally important criminals like Carlos Marcello. The first witness cited by the Senate Committee for Contempt, Harry Russell of Chicago and Miami, goes on trial on contempt charges in Washington Wednesday. The maximum penalty for each offense, each unanswered question could be a separate offense, is 1 year's imprisonment or a $1,000 fine, or both. When Senator Kefauver made his accusations, it sent shockwaves through many circles. Numerous individuals rushed to declare their innocence, especially those who had been connected to businesses controlled by mobsters or were accused of selling their businesses to them. Many feared being called to testify and instead chose to write anonymously to various newspapers, asking them to correct stories or statements made by Senator Kefauver or by the newspapers. One such story, related to Carlos Marcello, was published following testimony heard on February 1st. The article was printed after being submitted on January 31st, and it shed new light on the ongoing investigation. Letters from the people. This department welcomes letters on matters of current interest. Please be brief and courteous. Anonymous communications receive no consideration, but names and addresses may be withheld from publication on request. Letters will not be returned. Clarifies testimony. Biloxi, January 31st, 1951. The Daily Herald. I am writing in response to an article appearing in the Saturday afternoon issue of your paper, January 27th, 1951. You stated, and I quote, that most of the answers to queries by Senator Kefauver and Mr. Downey Rice, Assistant Legal Counsel, were such statements as, I don't think I should incriminate myself by answering that, unquote. This is incorrect, as I only refused to answer 2 questions, and Senator Kefauver instructed Mr. Rice not to ask me any more questions regarding gambling. Your article also stated, and I quote, I bought the United Novelty Company from Carlos Marcello in 1945, unquote. This is not true, and I made no such statement. Carlos Marcello never owned any part of the United Novelty Company nor any other business with which I have been associated. I did testify, and I speak from the record, that Mr. Pace and I purchased the Dixie Coin Machine Company from Carlos Marcello and F. Natasi in 1945, and I acquired the Pace interests in 1947. You further stated, and I quote, "He said he has the United Novelty Company, a Biloxi corporation," unquote. This is also incorrect. My testimony will show that I sold the United Novelty Company to its present owners in 1945, and that Nick Carbajal and I were partners in the Crown Novelty Company, Inc., in New Orleans, Louisiana, and have a branch office in Jefferson Parish using the trade name of Rex Novelty Company. At this time, I would like to clear up a confused issue regarding the testimony of Mayor Morrison of New Orleans. The mayor, reading from a document prepared by Police Sergeant Earl Weiser, stated, and I quote, "The Dixie Coin Machine Company is operated today in my name, and Marcello and Matranga were associated with me in the Rex Novelty Company, Jefferson Parish," unquote. Sergeant Weiser has never contacted me regarding my New Orleans holdings, and both of the above statements are incorrect. The Dixie Coin Machine Company is owned by the present owners of the United Novelty Company, and Marcello, Matranga, or anyone else has never owned any part of the Rex Novelty Company, which is owned by Mr. Carbajal and me. It is not my intention to criticize Mayor Morrison, as he read from notes furnished him by his department. I want to further state that I appeared as a voluntary witness, and since my testimony was under oath, I believe you will agree that the public should be given the true facts as testified on the witness stand, which is now a matter of federal record. May I add that Senator Kefauver and his assistants were very courteous and considerate at all times, never using high-pressure methods in asking questions. Thank you for granting me this space. John J. Bertucci. The Senate committee hearings investigating the New Orleans crime families, their history, and their ruthless tactics sent ripples of change through the city. However, some argue that real change was elusive. These men knew how to present themselves in front of the cameras, putting up the right facade when needed. They were adept at cleaning up their image, shaking off bad press, and continuing their operations as usual. Allegedly, behind closed doors, this is exactly what began to happen. New sheriffs were appointed, but they were just as corrupt as their predecessors, and in some cases, some of the predecessors were still around. They just started putting up legitimate fronts. This article delves into the aftermath of those sheriffs and what they were saying and not doing. It explored the ongoing influence of the New Orleans crime families and the consequences that followed during the early 50s. Return of Senate Committee to New Orleans is a possibility. New Orleans, Associated Press, Senator Kefauver's Crime Committee, whose recent hearing apparently dealt a staggering punch to metropolitan area gambling here, may come back to try for a knockout. Downey Rice, Associate Counsel of the committee, who did much of the interrogating during the hearing, said in Washington last night that New Orleans may get another probe. His announcement came just a few hours after Sheriff Frank Clancy, perennial boss of casino-dotted Jefferson Parish, adjacent to New Orleans, made the flat statement that gambling is through here as long as I'm sheriff. "Through taking the rap, I'm through taking the rap for these people," Clancy said in an interview yesterday on his cattle farm north of Moisant International Airport in Jefferson Parish. For the second consecutive night, the plush casinos like the Beverly Club, Club Forest and others grossing more than $1 million a year were closed down. Except for the explanation, "I'm through taking the rap," Sheriff Clancy's action was still a puzzle. The diminutive, ruddy-faced Clancy steadfastly claimed up before the Kefauver Committee and now faces a possible contempt citation for it. While Senator Kefauver and his staff were in New Orleans, the casinos operated at full blast. The closing order came after Kefauver left town. Clancy was asked, "What if you get a mandate from the people to let the clubs stay open?" "Then they will have to get themselves another sheriff." It will be tough for the old and crippled ones, but it is all over as long as I am in office. He indicated he had taken the rap of unfavorable publicity and other indignities for the parish people, and that his patience was exhausted. The closing of Jefferson Parish gambling palaces would knock out a big percentage of the gambling dollar volume in Greater New Orleans. These Jefferson Parish clubs caused Senator Kefauver to comment, "There is more gambling on the outskirts of New Orleans than in Nevada, where gambling is legal." Parish towns not affected. Clancy said his closing order did not apply to parish towns where home rule leaves law enforcement up to the city marshal. The parish seat, Gretna, Louisiana, is headquarters for Carlos Marcello, whom Kefauver called one of the principal criminals of the United States, and J. Fogarty, boss of the racing wire. Marshal Beauregard Miller, who told Kefauver that gambling was the town's principal business, could not be reached for comment on Clancy's action. Also unreachable for comment was dandy Phil Kastel, who owns the Beverly Club with New York gambler Frank Costello, Marcello, and others. Downey Rice mentioned the possibility of locating some additional witnesses if the committee returned for more hearings. Kefauver said earlier that some of the witnesses who refused to testify at last week's hearing have indicated they might now be willing to speak up in hopes of escaping possible prosecution for contempt. Rice last night said no decision has been reached. The sheriff's words were not confined to just one newspaper. They were broadcast across multiple outlets. Another article detailed some of his statements and his promises of ushering in a possible era of change. However, despite these bold declarations, genuine change seemed highly unlikely. "Gambling is dead in Jefferson Parish," says Sheriff by Keith Fuller, New Orleans, January 31st, Associated Press. "Gambling is dead in adjacent Jefferson Parish," Sheriff Frank Clancy, political boss of the parish known as Clancy's Kingdom, said today. "I'm through taking the rap," the sheriff declared in an interview at his cattle farm about 10 miles west of New Orleans. The cowboy-garbed sheriff said flatly, "Gambling is through here as long as I'm sheriff?" When asked, "What if you get a mandate from the people to let the clubs stay open?" Clancy responded, "Then they'll have to get themselves another sheriff. It will be tough on the old and crippled people who work there, but it's all over as long as I'm in office." He indicated he had borne the brunt of unfavorable publicity, newspaper campaigns, and other raps for the parish people. Clancy's refusal last week to answer questions from the Senate Crime Investigating Committee brought a recommendation that Clancy be cited for contempt. The sheriff's closing order had an immediate effect on the kingdom. All the casinos closed last night, with only the dining rooms operating. Clancy said the casinos had put a lot of people to work and brought a lot of money into the parish, and the parish people had condoned them for years. New Orleans, January 31st, Associated Press. The New Orleans States reported that 25 dice dealers and other employees of Jefferson Parish gambling spots applied today for unemployment compensation. Gambling spots in unincorporated portions of the parish were closed last night on orders of Sheriff Frank Clancy. The unemployed casino workers are eligible for payments up to $25 per week for periods varying with their length of employment, the states said. Clancy talked with an open frankness about the big casinos, which caused Senator Estes Kefauver, committee chairman, to comment, "There is more gambling in the outskirts of New Orleans than in Nevada, where gambling is legal." Clancy stated, "They'll go to jail if my order isn't carried out. I'm going to enforce it as long as I'm in office." He continued, "They are welcome to get a new sheriff. I'll just own my porch there and take it easy." He pointed to a partially finished house he is building on his efficient cattle farm. If Clancy backs up his words with action, the big multi-million-dollar-a-year casinos like the Beverly Club, Club Forest, Old Southport Club, and others will be out of business. The Beverly Club, which Kefauver's committee spotlighted at its hearing here last week, is partially owned by New York gambler Frank Costello. Dandy Phil Kastel is the manager, and Gretna, Louisiana-based Vice Lord Carlos Marcello also has ties to the club. Kefauver called Marcello one of the principal criminals of the United States. The complete disappearance of gambling in Jefferson Parish outside the jurisdiction of New Orleans marshals of the parish towns is possible, Clancy said. I won't interfere with the incorporated towns. They have home rule, and it will be up to the marshals to decide whether they want gambling. Gretna, the parish seat and headquarters of Marcello and J.J. Fogarty, was not affected by Clancy's order. City Marshal Beauregard Miller could not be reached for comment, nor could Kastel or operators of the other casinos. Iberia DA to take notice of corruption. New Iberia, Louisiana, January 31st, Associated Press. Iberia Parish District Attorney L.O. Picott of Franklin said today, I am certainly going to take notice of the charges of graft and corruption in Iberia, as disclosed by the Kefauver Crime Investigating Committee. Picott said he expected to make a full investigation of these charges. Volunteer witness Warren J. Moiety of New Iberia testified before the Crime Committee in New Orleans last week that vice conditions controlled politics in the parish and that an organized shakedown of slot machine operators was being made. As a result of his testimony, the committee asked Sheriff Gilbert Ozen and City Marshal Howard LeBove to appear for questioning. Both officials complied, but both denied payoffs. The sheriff and marshal said slot machines were operating and that zoned prostitution was tolerated. Carlos Marcello refused to answer any questions during the committee hearings, often responding with no comment, a total of 168 times. When asked about his citizenship, he declined to cooperate, similar to other mobsters like Joe Adonis and Russell Bufalino, who falsely claimed to be born in the United States. Authorities, however, began digging into their backgrounds, uncovering the truth behind these lies. In 1951, during his own hearings, Frank Costello, frustrated by repeated questions about his finances, simply got up and walked away, the only mobster to do so. While others pleaded the Fifth, Costello's defiance highlighted the growing tension between the government and organized crime. The looming threat of deportation was a significant concern for these mobsters, and it resurfaced during the Kennedy years, and again in 1958 and 1959 during further investigations into organized crime. Questions arose about why figures like Tommy Lucchese, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Carlos Marcello had not been deported. This next article details the fear these mobsters felt when the possibility of tougher deportation laws emerged. At that time, America exerted significant influence over Sicily, controlling the island through financial aid and by supporting mafiosi to combat communism. However, when certain mobsters were deported, they reorganized the Sicilian mafia in the image of its American counterpart, expanding narcotics, prostitution, and other rackets. After Kefauver's hearings, Frank Costello faced the serious threat of deportation. He looked his lawyers, two of the most powerful in America at the time, George Wolfe and George Levy, straight in the face and told them that if they did not resolve this issue, they would be fired. For Costello, deportation was simply not an option, not even for a figure as powerful as him. Despite considering these lawyers as brothers, he made it clear they would be dismissed if they failed to fix this one issue. Fortunately for them, they managed to resolve the matter and avoid deportation. By February 3, 1951, this fear was becoming a reality, with figures like Joe Adonis and others facing deportation. This article captures the historical context and the chilling consequences that followed. Deportation Law to Battle Crime. By Charles B. Seib, INS Staff, Correspondent Washington, INS. Senate crime investigators suggested today that tighter deportation laws might help the United States weed out its criminals. Chairman Kefauver, Democrat from Tennessee, told newsmen that his committee has asked the Immigration Service to recommend changes in the law that would make it easier to eject aliens with criminal records. Kefauver said that the creation by a group of aliens of a criminal empire in South New Orleans, which is beginning to rival that of Al Capone, prompted the committee's interest in the deportation of undesirable foreigners. The senator said the inquiry to the immigration officials specifically asked why Carlos Marcello, whom he mentioned as one of the leaders of the New Orleans Empire, has not been deported, and what changes in the laws are necessary to take care of situations like his. According to Kefauver, Marcello came to the United States in 1910 from Tunis, Africa. Concerning Marcello's record, Kefauver said, "He served a sentence in Atlanta on a narcotics charge, had another conviction on a state charge, has substantial police record, and has his finger in various types of interstate and big-time criminal activities." Kefauver stated that Marcello and his brothers are building up a criminal empire in South New Orleans with connections and activities in other states, and continued, "This empire is substantial, influential, and well-financed. We want to put people on notice that we are serious about dismantling this criminal outfit in South New Orleans." Marcello is one of 9 additional recalcitrant witnesses against whom the committee decided Monday to ask for contempt of Congress citations. He refused to answer questions at a recent hearing in New Orleans. Kefauver said that if men like Marcello can remain in the country, we must need a change in the law. On February 6, 1951, various judges began to dismiss charges brought against mobsters during the Senate hearings, including contempt charges. One notable case involved Harry Russell, a gambler from Chicago and Miami, who was acquitted of 60 counts by a court-directed ruling. This article delves into Russell's history and the judge responsible for his acquittal. The judge's name was prominently printed, with the headline, "Acquits Gambler," subtly putting him on blast. At the time, the public began to scrutinize judges who were lenient with mobsters. What many did not realize was that these judges were not living lavish lifestyles on their own. They were being lavishly compensated by organized crime. Mobsters provided them with everything from trips to casinos and brothels to luxury vacations, boxing matches, and even yachts. Some judges' daughters had their weddings paid for by the mafia. This article reveals who the judge was and the mobsters he was planning to let off. On 60 counts of contempt, Washington, February 5th, United Press. Harry Russell, a gambler from Chicago and Miami, won a court-directed acquittal on 60 counts of contempt of Congress today in a decision that may challenge the successful government prosecution of some 75 other pending contempt cases. Federal Judge F. Dickinson Letts ruled that Russell was privileged to remain mute on constitutional grounds of possible self-incrimination when he refused to answer questions posed by the Senate's Special Crime Investigating Subcommittee. The spurned questions dealt with the 59-year-old Chicagoan's connections with the Miami Beach S&G gambling combine and his acquaintanceship with a long list of underworld characters. Judge Letts delivered the court-directed verdict before Russell's attorney could even open the defense. While Russell was charged with 60 counts of contempt, each carrying a maximum penalty of 1 year's imprisonment and a $1,000 fine, he reportedly refused to answer 107 of the committee's questions. Crime Committee Chairman Kefauver, a Democrat, said it is unfortunate that the verdict cannot be appealed. However, he refused to interpret it as the final ruling on nearly 20 contempt cases brought by his group. The Justice Department declined to comment on the ruling, pending a close study of the decision. After giving his verdict, Letts, an Iowa Republican who has been on the federal bench since 1931, called the jury back into court and dismissed it. 18 other contempt of Congress cases have been initiated by the Crime Subcommittee, including those against Chicago gambling chief Anthony J. "Tony" Accardo, Joe Adonis, New York operator; Jack I. Dragner, West Coast racketeer; Sheriff Frank J. King, Clancy, of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana; Carlos Marcello, reputed head of the New Orleans underworld; and Dandy Phil Kastel, a gambling associate of Frank Costello. Another 57 contempt cases were brought by the House Un-American Activities Committee. Several more were brought by the House Lobby Investigating Group and the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee, looking into charges of communist infiltration in government, spearheaded by Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, a Republican from Wisconsin. Legal experts considered Letz's decision to be in line with recent Supreme Court rulings that the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination applies to witnesses before a federal grand jury and an Immigration Service inspector. It would appear to place congressional committees in the same category. They said it might throw a roadblock in the way of Senator McCarran's new investigation of subversive activities, as most lawyers are advising clients to plead the same self-incrimination grounds in refusing answers. King Clancy, the sheriff who promised to change everything, was actually a skilled liar and a significant player in the underworld. Senator Tobey, recognizing Clancy as a major threat and deeply corrupt, boldly vowed to oust him. Tobey challenged the governor, insisting that if he had any courage, he would personally remove Clancy from office. When Tobey confronted Clancy with this challenge, Clancy simply smirked and replied, "I guess he would," hinting that even the governor of Louisiana did not have the nerve to take him on. Tobey says, "Governor with Guts would oust Clancy," by John Chadwick Washington, February 7th, Associated Press. Senator Tobey, a Republican from New Hampshire, told Sheriff Frank J. King, Clancy, of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, today that if Louisiana's governor had some guts, he would kick Clancy out of office. Tobey's outburst followed testimony by Clancy before the Senate Crime Investigating Committee, in which Clancy admitted that he had broken his oath of office by failing to enforce anti-gambling laws. Clancy is a political power in Jefferson Parish, which adjoins New Orleans. He has been sheriff since 1928. "If you had a governor who had some guts, he would kick you out of office, wouldn't he?" Tobey demanded of the stocky, ruddy-faced sheriff. "I guess he would," Clancy agreed. "Then he hasn't any, has he?" Tobey persisted. "I wouldn't say that," Clancy replied. "Well, you wouldn't have much respect for him, would you?" Tobey asked. Clancy murmured something about not wanting to say anything disrespectful about the governor. As the sheriff hesitated, Tobey said he gathered that Clancy would not want to say he would not respect the governor. Clancy was silent, and then Tobey snapped, "All right, I'll say it then." Tobey did not mention Louisiana's governor, Earl K. Long, by name. The governor is a brother of the late Huey P. Kingfish Long, former governor and senator. Earl Long is also an uncle of Senator Russell Long, a Democrat from Louisiana. At a committee hearing in New Orleans on January 26th, Clancy refused to answer many questions on the grounds that he might incriminate himself, and the crime investigators promptly voted to ask the Senate to cite him for contempt of Congress. Prior to today's hearing, which was arranged at Clancy's request, the sheriff said he was ready to answer anything, and the committee decided to give him a chance to prove it. The gray-haired witness, dressed in a dark brown suit and a bright-figured tie, said he also thought something ought to be said in fairness to Jefferson Parish, adding that it is not as bad as it sometimes has been portrayed. Senator Tobey broke in sharply to ask Clancy if he were up here to defend Jefferson Parish or to tell us about your income and what you've been doing. "I'll have to defend myself," Clancy replied. He added that he did not want to say that Jefferson Parish was free of crime or anything like that. But as far as gambling in Jefferson Parish is concerned, he said, it has been going on for hundreds of years. Clancy said he presumed that any man running for office, at least up to the present time, unless he has allowed for it, could not be elected. He went on to say that gambling places in the parish give employment to more than 1,000 persons, a lot of them old and underprivileged people who could not get other jobs. Clancy said that today, however, work is more plentiful, and the continued operation of the gambling places is unnecessary to provide employment. Tobey broke in again to note that gambling was illegal in Louisiana, and that Clancy, as a sheriff, had taken an oath to enforce the law. "Did you do it?" Tobey demanded. "I can't say that I did," Clancy replied. "Then you have broken your oath of office?" Tobey persisted. "I broke it for the sake of these old and unfortunate people who needed jobs," Clancy told him. Clancy said, however, that "this committee has shown me more gambling than I knew of in Jefferson Parish." And, referring to the lid he has clamped on gambling in the unincorporated parts of the parish since the committee recommended contempt action against him, Clancy said, "I thought it was time now that some of these places be converted to other uses." He said he believed the people who had been employed in them could now find work in defense plants. He listed 2 casinos, the Beverly Club and the Club Forest, as among the places that have been closed by his edict. Committee Chairman Kefauver, a Democrat from Tennessee, asked him whether the Billionaires Club in Gretna, Louisiana, also had been shut down. Clancy said it had not, because his order did not apply to incorporated towns in the parish. His policy, he said, is to let the chiefs of police run their own municipalities. "But you have concurrent jurisdiction in Gretna, don't you?" Tobey asked. Clancy said it was a legal question, but added, "That's the chief of police's duty." "But you have sworn to uphold the law, and you haven't done it," Tobey said. "That's right," Clancy agreed. The Beverly Club, which Clancy said has now been closed, is owned in part by Frank Costello of New York. Others described by the committee as partners include dandy Phil Kastel and Carlos Marcello, whom Kefauver has referred to as one of the nation's worst criminals. Lush gambling casinos continued to operate openly in the parish, while Kefauver's committee was in New Orleans for 2 days of hearings as part of its nationwide investigation of organized crime. Upon the committee's return to Washington, it promptly voted to ask the Senate to cite Clancy for contempt of Congress. Upon conviction, contempt is punishable by up to a year in jail and a $1,000 fine. Dismissal by a district court on Monday of a contempt indictment against gambler Harry Russell apparently had not changed Clancy's mind about telling what he knows. Shortly after the committee asked the Senate to cite Clancy for contempt, he clamped the lid on gambling in the unincorporated parts of his parish, closing the casinos and removing slot machines. He also sent word to the crime committee that he would like to testify. He told reporters before leaving for Washington that he was now ready to answer anything they ask. He said his new ban on gambling was going to stick as long as he was sheriff, and that he was through taking the rap for these people. Kefauver telegraphed Clancy that the committee was willing to give him another chance to answer questions, provided he came to Washington at his own expense. "After your testimony has been given," Kefauver wired him, "the committee will determine whether or not to proceed with a contempt citation against you on the basis of your New Orleans testimony." At the committee's New Orleans hearing, Kefauver had given Clancy a tongue-lashing. "If there is any citizen of the parish that testimony should not tend to incriminate," Kefauver said, "it should be the sheriff." The headlines continued the next day, with the Tampa Tribune on February 8, 1951, carrying a bold message, "Do you have the guts?" This stirred even more shockwaves and heightened the urgency to address the crime in New Orleans. For the first time, there was a new focus on the criminal activities in Louisiana and neighboring states. Arkansas had Oni Madden, one of New York's most powerful gangsters, come into the South, who was also aligned with Carlos Marcello, while Florida was linked to Santo Traficante, who was believed to be hiding out in Cuba. Attention was increasingly drawn to organized crime, their gambling operations, and the politicians they influenced. Louisiana Sheriff admits Governor Long probably lacks guts to kick him out. Sheriff Frank J. Clancy, AP wire photo. Clancy blistered by Senator Tobey as political vermin. Washington, February 7th, AP. Sheriff Frank J. King, Clancy of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana, admitted to the Senate Crime Committee today that Governor Earl Long of Louisiana would probably fire him if the governor had some guts. In his testimony, Clancy acknowledged that he permitted wide-open gambling and banked $78,000 himself in the last 4 years on horse racing and other bets. Forcing a bleak grin, the ruddy-faced sheriff sat through a blistering tirade by Senator Tobey, RNH, who said it was disgusting that political vermin like Clancy could hold office. Guesses so Clancy's domain, a little county known as a parish, adjoins New Orleans. If you had a governor who had some guts, he would kick you out of office, wouldn't he? Tobey roared. I guess he would, Clancy replied hoarsely. At Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Governor Long shrugged off Tobey's accusation. I have no right to kick, Governor Long said. That's up to the district attorney or the people. It would take a special session of the legislature. Why don't you resign? Why don't you resign? Resign and let someone take over who has guts. Don't you feel guilty as hell? Aren't you a little ashamed of yourself, Clancy? Can you look him in the face? At night, can you look your grandchildren in the face? Tobey demanded. Well, Clancy mumbled, it wasn't the thing to do. Tobey snorted. Hell, it's disgusting that a man like you can continue in office, he said. What is America coming to? In between Tobey's outbursts, Clancy offered a formula on how to win at the races. That came when Tobey demanded, how can you explain the fact that most people lose at the racetrack, but you came away with $78,000 in 4 years? Well, said Clancy, they play all the races. I just bet on the last race or the last 2 races. Puzzled, Chairman Kefauver asked, what's the difference between the first race and the last race? Well, Clancy said, if you play the first race and get hooked, you stay for the rest of the races and usually lose. If you play the last race and win, you go home a winner. Calls It Tragedy spectators in the hearing room greeted Clancy's answer with a burst of laughter, but Tobey snapped, this is not comedy, this is tragedy. The sheriff said he sometimes got tips on races from stable boys and jockeys. He said they sometimes came to him for money when they were broke. Here you are, the sheriff sworn to uphold the law, Tobey said, and playing gambling games you took an oath to abolish, and you made $78,000 in 4 years. No wonder you sit there and say it's a good world. That may be the way you put it, Senator. Clancy nodded amiably. And you sit there smiling, Tobey said. I wish I could smile at such things. How do you do it? Well, Senator, maybe it's because I always try to smile. Wearing a dark brown suit, tan shirt, and bright red-figured tie, Clancy told the lawmakers he permitted gambling in his parish for the sake of old and unfortunate people who needed jobs in the casinos. Clancy blandly conceded that his office ran what amounted to an employment agency for gamblers. In fairness to Jefferson Parish, it's not as bad as it has sometimes been painted, Clancy said, going on for years. I don't want to say that Jefferson Parish was free of crime or anything like that, but as far as gambling goes, it has been going on for hundreds of years. The sheriff went on to say he guessed that any man running for office, at least up to the present time, unless he was for it, gambling, could not be elected. Employed 1,000, Clancy said gambling in the parish provided work for about 1,000 people, and collections from gambling houses went to charity and churches. He named Deputy Paul Kastel as one of the collectors. He said he had no idea how much had been taken in. The sheriff denied that he personally received any of the money and said he never accompanied his deputy on the collection rounds. How do you check up on him? He was asked. The people who ask for contributions usually go with him. Clancy replied. You mean ministers accompanied him? Oh no, Clancy said. They never did. The sheriff said jobs in the gambling casinos went mostly to old and underprivileged people who could not get other jobs. Getting better now. But he said the employment situation in the parish is improving now, with work more plentiful, so the continued operation of the gambling joints is no longer needed to provide employment. Tobey broke into note that gambling is illegal in Louisiana and demanded to know whether Clancy had carried out his oath to enforce the law. "I can't say that I did," Clancy replied. "Then you have broken your oath of office." Tobey persisted. "I broke it for the sake of these old and unfortunate people who needed jobs," the sheriff said. "You have sworn to uphold the law, and you haven't done it." "That's right," Clancy agreed. Denies agreement under questioning by Chairman Kefauver. Clancy denied that he had any agreement with state officials to let gambling run in his parish, or that he consulted with state authorities about his recent crackdown on gambling in the rural, unincorporated areas. He also denied receiving any political campaign funds from slot machine operators or the owners of gambling casinos. "You didn't get anything from them?" Kefauver asked. "No, sir," the sheriff said. Kefauver then asked Clancy to explain how the swank Beverly Club in Gretna got the okay to open. "This place was there," Clancy said, "and some fellows had been operating it at a loss. They were going to sell. Phil Kastel asked me about taking it over. I said they would have to put some of our people to work. He did. I never heard any complaints from the people." Clancy said the Beverly Club is now closed. He said it is owned in part by Frank Costello of New York, with partners including Dandy, Phil Kastel, and Carlos Marcello. Kefauver has described Marcello as one of the nation's worst criminals. 2nd Louisiana Sheriff promises no action New Orleans, February 7th, JP. While Jefferson Parish Sheriff Frank J. Clancy was promising the Kefauver Committee today he would clean up gambling in his parish, St. Bernard Parish Sheriff C.F. Dutch. Rowley said he is like the 3 blind mice about gambling in his parish. St. Bernard Parish adjoins New Orleans to the east, while Jefferson adjoins to the west. "I have no comment to make about what I'm going to do," Rowley said in an interview. "I haven't seen any gambling here yet. I am just like the 3 blind mice. I see nothing, I know nothing, I hear nothing." All this pressure was beginning to have an effect. On February 8, 1951, the Minneapolis Stop ran a headline, "Clancy Kingdom to quit gambling." Sheriff sees the light. Clancy's Kingdom to quit gambling. Minneapolis Star, Washington, D.C., Sheriff Frank J. King. Clancy told the Kefauver Senate Crime Committee on Wednesday the story of a famous Louisiana gambling parish just outside New Orleans, known as Clancy's Kingdom. He watched as Senator Kefauver, Democrat, Tennessee, the committee chairman, pointed him out on a chart as a principal in an organization labeled the Marcello Crime Dynasty of Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, with Carlos Marcello, a convicted narcotics trafficker, designated as the #1 man. Under relentless questioning, Clancy denied that any of his actions involved protection payoffs from gamblers. "Why do other people go broke betting while you always win?" demanded Senator Tobey, Republican, New Hampshire, criticizing Clancy's consistent success at gambling. Clancy admitted that he had been wrong in permitting open gambling. He confessed that his strategy involved betting only on the last race or the final 2 races and relying on tips from stable boys and horse owners. This approach ensured that he could win without losing a significant amount. During recent hearings in New Orleans, Clancy was the first sheriff in the United States to refuse to answer the committee's questions. He appeared voluntarily to correct this mistake and clear himself of contempt charges. He became convinced on the witness stand that he should have closed all gambling houses in his parish, rather than just those outside the incorporated towns, following the Kefauver investigation. He promised to shut down all gambling operations by 6 p.m. on the day of his arrival. and with the guidance from the committee, to make Jefferson Parish a better place. Clancy discussed his salary of $1,800 a year and revealed that his income for the last 4 years had averaged between $20,000 and $50,000 annually. He also noted that $78,000 of this amount came from betting on horse races. In his 22 years as sheriff, Clancy had always insisted that gambling should be managed locally. However, he admitted he had broken this rule by allowing Dandy Phil, Kastel, and Frank Costello from New York City to take over major gambling operations. With the advent of new job opportunities created by war plants, Clancy stated that gambling was no longer necessary for the local economy, and that he would stop it unless obstructed by Beauregard Miller, his political rival, and the Marshal of Gretna, the parish seat, where the largest casinos and the sheriff's office are located. Despite public pressure, it was clear that this was just a front, a strategic move to set himself up for another run at the election. On February 8th, the article reported Clancy's promise to quit his gambling habits. But by February 9th, another article revealed his plans to run again. This sequence of events clearly demonstrated his intention to stay in power and continue his reign of corruption. Clancy plans to run again. Sheriff called Political Vermin Scoffs at Retirement Idea New Orleans, February 9th. Jefferson Parish. Sheriff Frank Clancy, called Political Vermin by the Senate Crime Committee, arrived back home from Washington last night and said with a smile that he will make a personal inspection of his parish today to make sure the gambling lid is on tight. He predicted, "I'll be re-elected sheriff next January, even though he has halted gambling in his parish, notorious for its glittering, gaudy casinos." He scoffed at the suggestion he might retire. He plans to continue betting his special system on the racehorses. Clancy testified before the Senate committee on Wednesday that his special system had netted him $78,000 in the last 4 years. After refusing to testify before a Senate crime committee hearing here recently, Clancy went to Washington on Wednesday and detailed the gambling activities in his parish. He had been threatened with a Senate contempt citation for refusing to testify at the New Orleans hearing on the grounds that it might incriminate him. After Clancy spoke freely on Wednesday, the committee announced that he had purged himself of Senate contempt action. Clancy issued an order to close all gambling operations in the parish to his deputies in a telephone conversation from Washington late Wednesday. Asked about the severity of the gambling ban in his parish, referred to locally as Clancy's Kingdom, the sheriff replied curtly, "Everything's closed down and it's going to stay that way." Referring to individuals in his parish who might object to his order, Clancy said, "That's their hard luck. Everything was closed last night, and it had better be that way now." The nattily-dressed sheriff laughed when he was asked whether he planned to continue playing with the horses. "Yes, I'm going to keep at it." "You still plan to make money from betting?" a reporter asked. "Yes, you see, I just played the last 2 races. It is hard to lose that way. If you play the first ones, you lose what you win on the last ones." Meanwhile, the Citizens League of Jefferson Parish has made plans to meet on Sunday to map a fight for the recall of Clancy from office. The meeting was called by the Reverend E.V. Appling, pastor of Metairie Baptist Church. To obtain a recall election, the League must present Governor Earl K. Long with a petition signed by 25% of the parish's 32,016 registered voters. The prospect of a recall election apparently does not worry Clancy. He said he would win hands down in any recall election move that might be started against him. Clancy had no comment on the dressing down he received from Senator Tobey, Republican, New Hampshire, a member of the Senate Crime Committee who called the sheriff political vermin. Clancy returned to his ranch home at Kenner, Louisiana. In New Orleans, the Orleans Parish Grand Jury will resume its investigation on Tuesday of the income of criminal sheriff John Grosh, while he was New Orleans detective chief. The hearing, now in its third day, was prompted by the testimony of Grosh's ex-wife, Mrs. Viola Grosh, before the Senate Crime Committee. She told the committee that Grosh, then a city detective, had $150,000 in a safe in their home in 1940. Grosh testified before the committee that he never had a safe in his home. He denied ever having $150,000 in his home. The committee recommended that perjury charges be brought against Grosh as a result of the conflicting testimony. Contempt petitions were not filed against 3 New Orleans witnesses, against whom the committee previously announced it would recommend action. But Kefauver said they will be filed as soon as the required papers are completed. The 3 witnesses are Carlos Marcello, who Kefauver has described as one of the nation's worst criminals; dandy Phil Kastel, a co-owner with Marcello and Frank Costello of New York in the Beverly Club, a gambling casino near New Orleans; and Joseph Pareto, a racing news service figure. In laying the new contempt petitions before the Senate, Kefauver said he thought a federal district court judge in Washington, who earlier this week dismissed contempt of Congress charges against Chicago and Miami gambler Harry Russell, was clearly in error. Kefauver said the work of Senate and House committees would be greatly, unfairly, and improperly impeded if they had to follow the lines laid down by Judge F. Dickinson Letts in his ruling. Judge Letts held that Russell was within his constitutional rights in refusing to answer questions for fear of possible self-incrimination. On February 11, 1951, new headlines emerged detailing the infiltration of organized crime groups into the burgeoning gambling scene. Frank Costello was at the forefront of this movement, but behind closed doors he had the support of other influential gangsters. These headlines began to reveal not only their names, but also their photographs, exposing the broader network of power players involved in the operation. Gamblers' bet probe funds will run out before New Louisiana. Scandal is bared. By Keith Fuller and Roy Steinfurt, Associated Press staff writers, New Orleans. Gambling overlords are betting on Chairman Kefauver's Senate Crime Investigating Committee running out of money before an explosive second Louisiana scandal is touched off. And the barons are wagering their vice on the immediate future of keeping Frank Costello silent when he faces Kefauver at a hearing in New York City on Tuesday. The big question is, can the lanky Democratic senator from Tennessee show that Costello has made campaign contributions or other payments to political figures? The answers could ignite a second Louisiana scandal, perhaps for other states too. The regional gambling bosses, expecting that the committee will learn little new from Costello, hope the New York hearing will be the last, ending the entire investigation and causing little damage to their rackets. After recent hearings by the Senate Crime Committee here, Kefauver aides said there was unfinished business in New Orleans and indicated the committee might return. But Kefauver said in Washington on Friday that the committee has no plans to return to New Orleans for further hearings. A Louisiana Citizens Committee has asked the Kefauver group to come back. The biggest Louisiana political figure snared by the Kefauver net so far is Frank Clancy, sheriff and political boss of adjacent Jefferson Parish. The parish is known locally as Clancy's Kingdom. Big plush casinos operated with immunity in the parish until Clancy closed them recently. King Clancy avoided a contempt proceeding by appearing at his own expense in Washington last Wednesday to answer questions he had refused to answer at the committee's January 25 to 26 hearing in New Orleans. He also promised to enforce anti-gambling laws, but unless the committee can link the gamblers to more important political figures than Clancy, the gamblers are not seriously hurt. Jefferson is only one of many Louisiana parishes where gambling flourishes. The New Orleans probe revealed that Costello is a partner in the richly furnished Beverly Country Club in Jefferson, with dandy Phil Kastel and Carlos Marcello. Kastel operates the club. Marcello, a Sicilian whom Kefauver called one of the principal criminals of the United States, has headquarters in tiny Gretna, Louisiana, the parish seat of Clancy's kingdom, across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. But there the committee's trail on Costello ended. How did Costello get into Louisiana? On September 4, 1930, the New York Times reported that Frank Costello, who has been a witness before the New York grand jury, went to New Orleans when his slot machines were banned in New York in 1934. He made an arrangement with Huey Long for the operation of his machines there. He had more than 5,000 on location in New York in 1934. Together, they set up the Pelican Novelty Company, and the annual profit in a city 1/14 the size of New York was $800,000. New Orleans Mayor de Lesseps Morrison told the Kefauver Committee that Costello began operations in Louisiana in 1936. Louisiana's first scandals jolted the nation in 1939 to 1940, when former Governor Richard Leach and Louisiana State University President James M. Smith went to the penitentiary for using the mails to defraud, and a number of prominent men committed suicide. The gambling political tie-ups found in this latest investigation have been, so far, only on a city and parish level. Although Sheriff Clancy has held the spotlight recently while taking a blistering name-calling from Senator Tobey, Republican New Hampshire, in Washington last Wednesday, he is but one of 4 sheriffs the committee focused on during its sessions here. Others involved were Sheriff C.F. Dutch Rowley of St. Bernard Parish, bordering New Orleans on the east, Sheriff Gilbert Ozen of Iberia Parish, in the Evangeline country of the Old Spanish Trail, and Criminal Sheriff John Grosh of Orleans, New Orleans Parish. Clancy has shut down the gambling palaces in Jefferson Parish and said it was permanent, as long as I'm sheriff. But the gambling equipment has either been draped in dust covers or moved into back rooms, ready to reopen, maybe when Clancy is no longer sheriff. Clancy, who has ruled his domain since 1928, scoffed at reports that he would resign under pressure and said flatly he would run again in 1942 and win with or without the support of gamblers. It is still too early for any certainty about the future of this quartet of sheriffs. Clancy, by appearing before the Senate committee in Washington, purged himself of contempt. He smiled when Senator Tobey said it was disgusting that political vermin like Clancy could hold office. Clancy also agreed with Tobey that a governor who has some guts would remove him from office. But at the state capitol in Baton Rouge, Governor Earl K. Long, brother of the late Senator Huey Long and uncle of Senator Russell Long, Democrat Louisiana, commented, "I have no reason to kick, and it's up to the district attorney or the people." A group of ministers, who initially announced a plan to oust Clancy, have now reportedly decided to forgive the sheriff his 28-year blindness to gambling, in return for his word that the casinos will stay closed as long as he wears the badge. Tired of the flaps, the ruddy-faced sheriff, who owns a 1,000-acre cattle ranch in the parish, said he was tired of taking the rap for the gamblers. The gamblers agree that Clancy did take the rap and that he assumed a fall guy role, so they are content to move to other parishes if, as Clancy said, Jefferson is now closed to them permanently. "Taxes will be higher next year, and we can stand to take a vacation and lose a little money," a gambler told a reporter. "This will blow over." Sheriff Rowley, who grimly admitted to the committee in New Orleans that a full-scale gambling operation had run wide open in St. Bernard Parish ever since I can remember, has not interfered with casinos in his domain. Rowley said in a Wednesday interview that as far as gambling was concerned, "I'm just like the 3 blind mice." He was apparently referring to the 3 fabled monkeys, for he went on to say, "I see nothing, I know nothing, I hear nothing." Leander Perez, national chairman of the state's rights political party and district attorney of the parish, said, "Rowley is the sheriff. He is a law enforcement officer. No evidence has been presented to me about gambling." Sheriff Ozen told Kefauver that slot machines and open prostitution were wide open in his Iberia parish, and there have been subsequent rumblings of a grand jury investigation. John Grosh's divorced wife told the Senate committee here that the dapper buttoned-down sheriff had $150,000 cash tucked away in an attic strongbox in 1940, which he had collected during a 6-year period from 1934 and 1940. During this span, he was a police detective with salaries ranging from $186 to $346 a month. Grosh denied having the money or the strongbox, but he did admit to Kefauver that he knew of gambling in New Orleans when he was a detective, but was too busy catching crooks and murderers to worry about it. Justice Office. Getz McCarthy, Pearson Row, Washington, United Press. A military secrets case, which has been a source of conflict between Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, Republican, Wisconsin, and columnist Drew Pearson, has been sent to the Justice Department for investigation. It was disclosed late yesterday. Secretary of the Army, Frank Pace, Jr., reported the action in separate letters to McCarthy and Pearson. Both of them released the letters to the news media. At the same time, they issued statements each claiming the other's activities were the primary focus of the inquiry. Pace told McCarthy that the Army's investigation of the incident has been completed with negative results. In both letters, he said the Army sent the matter to Defense Secretary George C. Marshall, who, in turn, referred it to the Justice Department. The case involves the publication in Pearson's newspaper columns of December 30th and January 31st of intelligence reports on the size of the communist forces in Korea, especially the Chinese Red Troop strength. McCarthy charged that this was a leak of military secrets and demanded that the persons responsible be identified. Later, Pearson claimed that McCarthy, by reading to the Senate the exact date of December 15, 1950, and Army No. 3019 from an Army report, himself violated security. McCarthy said he had sent Pace's letter dated February 7th to Chairman Richard B. Russell, Democrat, Georgia, of the Senate Armed Services Committee. In a letter to Russell, McCarthy charged that the January 31st publication came after a public announcement of an investigation of the earlier publications, and also after the Army reduced from 15 to 3 the number of daily copies it makes of its intelligence summary. McCarthy told Russell, "It is difficult to understand why a thorough investigation by the Army did not disclose who was violating our espionage laws by stealing and handing to Pearson this material." On February 12, 1951, investigations took a significant turn when Kefauver moved into New York and began questioning Frank Costello. Notably, these inquiries led to questions about Benjamin Siegel, Carlos Marcello, and Virginia Hill. The scrutiny had an inevitable impact on Marcello, as many of the individuals being questioned were linked back to him. Kefauver says, "Testimony is interesting by Associated Press's New York, February 13th. The committee investigating interstate gambling reported it obtained interesting testimony from gambler Frank Costello and a New York State policeman. The testimony of both these witnesses was interesting," commented Senator Estes D. Kefauver, Democrat, Tennessee, committee chairman. Costello was questioned about his possible ownership of the New Orleans Beverly Club, described by a committee spokesman as a nightclub, restaurant, gambling casino. Inspector Charles LaForge was obviously called with respect to gambling at Saratoga, Kefauver said. LaForge's police jurisdiction encompasses Saratoga Springs, a fashionable upstate New York and horse racing center. Other Saratoga County residents have been called to testify, Kefauver added. Costello was cooperative, except for claiming the constitutional privilege of refusing to answer one question. He said the question was not of major consequence, but Senator Charles Tobey, Republican, New Hampshire, described it as the $64 question. The specific question was not disclosed. Dwyer invited Kefauver confirmed that former New York Mayor William O'Dwyer, now ambassador to Mexico, would be invited to testify before the committee in open hearings next month. O'Dwyer had earlier requested permission to be heard at the open hearings to make known the New York picture as he knows it, a committee spokesman said. Present closed hearings were regarded as a warm-up for the open hearings. By United Press, one of the witnesses, imprisoned ex-bookie king Frank Erickson, balked at answering the summons. Describing himself as an unwilling witness, he filed a show cause order in state Supreme Court against city officials who would deliver him to the committee. Politicians summoned. The initial group summoned by the committee also included James A. Leary, Republican County Chairman of Saratoga Springs, NY, and Arthur Leonard, Democratic leader there. Rudolph Halley, chief counsel for the committee, said the hearings were designed to get to the bottom of the New York story. The Kefauver committee may also hear from Virginia Hill, former girlfriend of slain mobster Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, in its public sessions next month. Halley said she had been subpoenaed, but probably would not be called for the current closed hearings. Deport, the law-breaking aliens, says Senator by Scripps Howard. Newspaper Washington, February 13th. The Kefauver Committee wants to deport every alien who is connected with gambling or other criminal activities. Senator Estes Kefauver, Democrat, Tennessee, said his committee has already asked the Immigration Bureau to deport Carlos Marcello, who is a key figure in the ongoing inquiry into gambling in New Orleans. We have asked the Immigration Service to show why these criminal aliens have been allowed to remain here and prey on the American public, the senator said. Marcello and his brothers are, I am convinced, partners of Frank Costello of New York, and are involved in a racing wire service and other criminal activities. Marcello, Kefauver said, was born in Tunis, Africa, to Sicilian parents, and was never naturalized. He served one term in the federal penitentiary at Atlanta on a narcotics conviction, and was sentenced to Louisiana prison for extortion, but was pardoned by the late Governor O.K. Allen. The hearings into organized crime, particularly those conducted by Kefauver, began to face financial constraints. New Orleans gangsters and corrupt politicians knew that Frank Costello had significant information that could lead investigators straight back to Louisiana. The risk of digging deeper into Costello's connections was substantial because of his immense influence. Costello was a formidable figure who wielded considerable power in both New York and Chicago, and his influence extended into Arkansas, Florida, Louisiana, Missouri, Michigan, and other states. His reach was so extensive that he had a hand in shaping national politics, having played a role in corrupting Tammany Hall and even influencing figures like Franklin D. Roosevelt. For politicians, Costello was a key player with the potential to determine their path to the White House. If Costello were to speak, it could spell immense trouble for the gangsters in New Orleans. Despite the pressure, Costello adhered to the Code of Omerta, refusing to betray his political and criminal contacts. He went to great lengths to protect both, even at the risk of facing prison. After the hearings ended, Costello faced tax issues, various subpoenas, and legal battles over his refusal to testify before the Senate committees. This article detailing these developments was published on February 13th. New Orleans gamblers fear second scandal in Kefauver crime. Quiz New Orleans, February 12th, AP. Gambling overlords are betting that Chairman Kefauver's Senate Crime Investigating Committee will run out of money before a potentially explosive second Louisiana scandal is uncovered. The vice barons are keeping a close watch on their kingpin, Frank Costello, who remains silent as he faces Kefauver at a hearing in New York on February 13th. The big question is whether the lanky Democratic senator from Tennessee can prove that Costello and his associates have made campaign contributions or other donations to important political figures. Such revelations could ignite a second Louisiana scandal, potentially affecting other states as well. Regional gambling bosses hope that the committee will find little new information from Costello and that the New York hearing will be the last. They hope the Kefauver committee will exhaust its funds, ending the investigation with minimal damage to their operations. After a recent hearing by the Senate Crime Committee in New Orleans, Kefauver's aides indicated that there was unfinished business and suggested the committee might return to New Orleans. However, Kefauver stated in Washington that there are no plans to return for further hearings. The most significant political figure ensnared by the Kefauver investigation so far is Frank Clancy, sheriff and political boss of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. Known locally as Clancy's Kingdom, the parish saw big, plush casinos operating with immunity until Clancy closed them last week. Clancy had dodged a hearing by appearing in Washington to answer questions from the committee. He also promised to enforce anti-gambling laws. Unless the committee can connect gamblers to more prominent political figures than Clancy, the gambling operations may not suffer significant harm. Jefferson Parish is just one of many in Louisiana where gambling flourishes. Kefauver's investigation revealed that Costello is a partner in the Beverly Country Club in Jefferson Parish, alongside dandy Phil Kastel and Carlos Marcello. Kastel operates the club, while Marcello, described by Kefauver as one of the principal criminals of the United States, is based in Gretna, across the Mississippi River from New Orleans. New Orleans Mayor de Lesseps Morrison told the Kefauver committee that Costello began his operations in Louisiana in 1936. The state's first major scandals occurred in 1939 and 1940 when former Governor Richard Leach and Louisiana State University President James M. Smith were imprisoned for mail fraud, and several prominent men committed suicide. Sheriff Clancy, who has ruled his domain since 1928, dismissed reports that he would resign under pressure and asserted he would run again in 1952, with or without the support of gamblers. A group of ministers who initially planned to oust Clancy have reportedly decided to forgive him his 28-year blindness to gambling, provided he keeps the casinos closed while he is sheriff. Sheriff C.F. Dutch Rowley of St. Bernard Parish admitted to the committee that gambling operations have been wide open in his parish ever since I can remember, and that he has not interfered with casinos in his jurisdiction. Sheriff Gilbert Ozen of Iberia Parish reported that slot machines and zoned prostitution were openly operating in his parish, and there have been rumblings of a grand jury investigation. Sheriff John Grosh of Orleans Parish, New Orleans, was accused by his ex-wife of having $150,000 in a strongbox, which he allegedly accumulated during a period when he was a police detective earning modest salaries. Grosh denied the allegations, but admitted to Kefauver that he had been involved in gambling, but was too busy catching crooks and murderers to worry about it. A grand jury is investigating his large income. Currently, New Orleans does not have large-scale gambling operations. Furtive racehorse handbooks continue in the city, but are limited since the shutdown of Jefferson Parish, which was their primary hub. Kefauver learned little from the gambler witnesses in New Orleans, as they refused to answer questions beyond providing their names and addresses.